He had the answer to inflation. The country's got to produce more goods. Then we got to have a little more unemployment. So when there's more goods to buy and less people who can afford to buy the goods, then the prices will come down.
That was Archie Bunker on All in the Family in 1974, talking about the issue of inflation. I'm glad that inflation has gone away since then. We don't worry about that anymore. Our guest, Ron Brownstein, right here, has written a whole book about that landmark year, 1974. Here it is. There it is on the screen. Rock Me on the Water, 1974, the year Los Angeles transformed movies, music, television, and politics. Again, it's out in paperback now. There's a lot to get into here, but let's try to separate it a little bit. Let's start with my favorite thing, which is TV. Of course, we're in the TV business here. So back in 1974, you had All in the Family, which was talking about families in new ways on TV. Also politics, of course. Mary Tyler Moore talked about women in the workplace in new ways. MASH talked about the Vietnam War. These shows were really talking about real issues that people cared about as compared to years before. It was all sort of fantasy land and escapism, right?
They lived in the same world as the viewers. I mean, Archie Bunker lived in the same world as the people watching the show. You know, and the basic story of Rock Me on the Water is that the pop culture produced in L.A. in the early 1970s, television, movies, and music, was the crucible in which the critique of American life that emerged out of all the social movements in the 1960s was kind of cemented into our consciousness, never to go away. Greater suspicion of business and government, you know, greater suspicion of authority, changing roles for women, changing relations between men and women.
Yeah, and then when it comes to movies, we had movies like Chinatown and the growing star power of Jack Nicholson, who was quite a player in the LA scene, too. It's great to hear about his off-the-screen stuff, too. And then you have Godfather 2 and the growing star power of Al Pacino. And, of course, this also new generation of directors like Francis Ford Coppola, and sort of the way that they view the world and how that started to change Hollywood and still is all these years later.
Right. I mean, as I said, the movies like television engaged with the world around them to an incredible extent, really starting with Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate in '67, and then the kind of the tipping point, Easy Rider in '69, but the incredible outpouring of movies in the early 1970s, Carnal Knowledge, Five Easy Pieces, Chinatown, Godfather 1, Godfather 2, The Candidate, a little later, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest Network. I mean, all of these movies, like the TV shows, believed that they could comment on the society around them. And one reason why the early 1970s is considered, along with the late 30s and early 40s, one of the two great periods in Hollywood history is that, as you noted, there were two distinct generations of directors producing much of their greatest work. You had an older generation like Robert Altman and Roman Polanski and Mike Nichols, who had been waiting for these doors to open, you know, who were kind of, you know, grinding away in the more formulaic stuff that both TV and movies did in the 1960s. And then you had the first movies by the directors born in the 40s, the movie brats, Spielberg, Scorsese, George Lucas, Brian De Palma. It's an incredible assemblage of talent. And I say they were almost like shooting volleys across the canyons back and forth at each other.
Let's talk about the music, because it was kind of crazy that almost all these guys were living like 1 or 2 blocks away from each other in Laurel Canyon, right? We have the Eagles were huge at this point, ended up releasing soon after one of the biggest selling albums of all time. We also had Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young going on a big tour in 1974. Joni Mitchell was at sort of the height of her power too, and also involved with a lot of these guys as well. Jackson Browne was very successful at this point. Your book is titled based off of one of his songs, of course. And then you especially get into Linda Ronstadt, who I think may be the most interesting character in your book. Let's listen to some of Linda's singing. I mean, she was so good, but she had a real struggle at this point.
She was, first of all, she was not only an incredible talent, she was maybe, along with Angelica Houston, the most perceptive observers of the scene. I mean, she really had a great understanding of other people, and she's just a really interesting and smart and perceptive person. Yeah, I mean, Linda Ronstadt, it's interesting. I mean, she came out here in the 60s. She had an early hit with, with her band, the Stone Ponies, but then really, for years, kind of was grinding gears. She was, like many in LA music in that period, she was trying to find a new synthesis between country and rock and rhythm and blues. And the record companies really didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't until she connected with Peter Asher in 1974, which is her breakthrough year. It was also the breakthrough year for the Eagles with their third album, On the Border. The biggest hit for Jackson Browne, his album that year, and Joni Mitchell, her biggest hit ever. It really was the apex of it. Was the moment when the Southern California sound really dominated the music conversation.
So when we talk about Linda Ronstadt, we also should mention her boyfriend at the time. Some people may have heard of him. He became the governor of California in 1974. The youngest governor in California history. Of course, we now know him as the oldest governor in California history, Jerry Brown, just 36 years old then.
And won his primary 2 weeks before the release of Chinatown, both against the backdrop of Watergate and a sense of pervasive corruption that he very, very successfully ran against as one of the first candidates anywhere in the country who brought that same critique of American life that emerged in the 60s that I talked about in pop culture. He brought it into the political arena. Him and Gary Hart in 74 really are the first ones.
And, of course, still impacting California politics to this day as well. All right, up next, we're going to have some fun on this show. We play a game called Personal Issues, so we're going to get to know some of your favorites. But let's go to break with some more music from this era. Crosby, Stills, and Nash take us to break. Stay with us. We are back with Ron Brownstein. We play a game on this show called Personal Issues. This is where we get to know you. We put 30 seconds up on the clock. You talk about a lot of other people's favorites in this book, Rock Me on the Water. Now we get to know your favorites, okay? So here we go. You ready to go?
Ready.
Let's do it. Favorite TV show?
All in the Family, I think.
What is your favorite book?
Master of the Senate, can't beat that, and Cavalier and Clay on the fiction side.
What about movie? Favorite movie?
Godfather, Chinatown, It's a Wonderful Life.
Who's your favorite sports team?
Red Sox.
What's your favorite musical artist or band?
Springsteen.
Oh, good choice there. And who is your role model?
You know, everyone would love to be Robert Caro, but that's beyond reach of us mere mortals. I would say actually Peter Gammons. The way he covered sports, it always inspired me to how I wanted to cover politics. But I think the person I follow whose tracks most clearly is Tom Etzel.
And who is that for people?
Tom Etzel is a great journalist and author from the Washington Post in the 80s and 90s, and now writes a column in the New York Times. He pioneered thinking about politics through the lens of demographics and social change, which is what I've tried to do over these last 30, almost 40 years now.
Yeah, and for people that may not know, Robert Caro written extensively about Lyndon Baines Johnson, these amazing books.
Master
and
of the
Peter
Senate.
Gammons for years was on ESPN, talking about baseball and all the rest of it.
Great writer for